Hi, this is Mr. Everett, and I am going to give you an AP US History YouTube lecture on the settling of New England and the people who settled there, the reasons why, and so on. So we're going to actually start with this PowerPoint by Miss Susan Posier, who is a wonderful and extraordinary AP US History teacher in Chappaqua, New York. We're going to today talk about the differences first between the Separatists and the Puritans, and it's important to recognize that these are two distinct groups, and even though they both settled Massachusetts, they do so for different reasons. So let's rewind a bit and go back to the very beginning and talk about where not just Puritanism comes from, but the idea of the Protestant faith in general, because this kind of plays into this religious ideology that the Puritans have about themselves and their mission on earth. So let's go back to even before John Calvin here, to 1517 with Martin Luther, who was a Roman Catholic priest who rebelled against the church for what he called outlandish and outrageous violations of the religious beliefs by the selling of indulgences by the popes, who by papal sanction had tried to really gain a lot of money for themselves, even though they had wasted millions by our standards of dollars in vastly extravagant feasts and wars and debauchery. So, long story short, Martin Luther helps to lead a revolution, a religious revolution against the Catholic Church. He declared that the Bible alone was the source of God's Word, and not the Church as an intermediary. And of course, since the Pope is in Catholicism, is the representative of the Church, Martin Luther specifically directed almost all of his attention against the popes who were current at that time. He also really instilled the belief that faith alone would determine salvation of a people. And, of course, this would create, with the help of the printing press, 100 years of war in Europe. And, of course, it's in this context that the fracturing of different Protestant beliefs begins to create different groups. And John Calvin, who was a follower of Luther, he elaborated on Luther's ideas in 1536 with his publication of the Institutes of Christian Religion. And John Calvin began with a couple basic beliefs, and some of these come to exemplify the behaviors of Puritans later on. So one of his beliefs was obviously that God was all-powerful and all good, but by contrast, humans were, due to original sin, very weak, very wicked. Okay, and because God was all-knowing, he was able to know through predestination the idea of who was going to heaven and hell. And the people who were chosen to have eternal salvation, they were known as the elect. And it's actually the elect that play a very important role in the establishment of the New England colonies, specifically in Plymouth and later in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. So the idea here was, contrary to what Luther taught about good works and salvation, that Calvin believed that good works alone could not save those who were predestined. But the problem was nobody knew what their status was. And so because you couldn't know whether you were doomed or whether you were saved, you had to have a very profound conversion experience. Okay? And that conversion experience almost always had to be public. And it was a sign from God that one was chosen. And those who had those conversion experiences, they were known as visible saints. Okay, and they were known to lead sanctified lives and live as models for the community. And this is kind of very important because there's a special mission that the Puritans believe that it's their duty to perform. And that plays a role later in again, the strong connection between church and state in the Massachusetts colony. So there was a group of Puritans. They wanted to reform the Church of England. There was another group that was upset with those reforms. Okay, the Church of England, by the way, was not Catholic, and so you're talking here about Protestants who want to break away from other Protestants. Okay, the Church of England was known as the Anglican Church, and these Puritans were Protestants who sought to get the Catholic part of the Anglican Church, which mostly they were concerned with relics and practices of services and so on out of the church. But not everybody in England agreed with this. In fact, not all Puritans agreed with this. And those who wanted to, those who wanted to get rid of those Anglican elements and Catholic elements, within the Anglican Church, they were known as Separatists. Okay, and they were actually led by a reverend whose name was John Robinson. Okay, now here's an example, by the way, of Puritans who are upset with the sanctification of Father Christmas. All right, who were the Separatists? The Separatists believed, as I mentioned earlier about visible saints, that they were the ones who should be admitted to the church. So, Separatists believed that they had to share churches with people who were damned, who were not visible saints. In other words, they weren't living a life of a special mission that was publicly demonstrated to be a model of the community. Okay? They wanted to break with the Church of England, and the government at the time did not support this. So you see in the map of England at the time that there are sections that predominantly supported the idea of not only separation from the Church of England, but migration to the New World. Okay, so we know that the Separatists did leave England, but they didn't go to America immediately. They went to Holland. They stayed there for 7 years. This was a profound experience for them, and in fact, it was the experience of many of the children that upset some of the original Separatists. They saw what they called a Dutchification of their children going on at the time. They were kind of assimilating into Dutch culture, which didn't really fit with this idea of a special mission. And so what they did was they negotiated with the Virginia Company to settle near its land. And they grabbed many non-Separatists to sail with them, including Miles Standish, and they eventually ended up at Plymouth Bay. So it's kind of important to note that even though the Separatists wanted to leave England and then leave Holland because they did not feel that the others around them were visible saints, that they did accept all of these non-visible saints to help them pilot their ship and later settle in their colony, which becomes kind of an interesting issue and plays into this idea of a paradox that I mentioned in class today, which is that if the Puritans were, or the Separatists in this case, were fleeing England to escape religious persecution, it's interesting that that's not the kind of place that they established. So, what they did is, on November 11th, 1620, they established the Mayflower Compact. It basically was an agreement that people agreed to abide by majority rule, and interestingly enough, that was something that secured rights for people who were non-separatists in this separatist group. Hey, it's important also to know that the Mayflower Compact was the settlers' way of legitimizing their rule outside the Virginia Compact that they had originally settled with the London companies. So what they wanted to do was create a secular document that recognized James I as their sovereign, and created a body of all the settlers with the power to devise laws and specifically elect leaders. So even though they said they were under English protection, they wanted the ability to create their own rules. And Plymouth Colony never actually possessed a charter. And that becomes an issue because later, of course, they become merged with the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Okay, so the compact was signed before they left the ship. It's not a constitution, it was an agreement, it was signed by only the men, and it established this idea that town meetings would become the legislative bodies of this new group of settlers. And that's kind of profound, actually, because it establishes kind of like a Greek version of democracy versus the idea of representative rule, where you actually choose somebody to speak for you. In this case, all the adult men who were landowners and were visible saints, they were the ones that actually made the laws. So, where does this go? Well, it creates this idea that in their community there was something that they called a covenant of grace. Okay, and this is a special agreement that the Puritan Separatists have with their belief in God. And again, it creates and reinforces this idea of a special mission, which they also began to reinforce with the idea of a social covenant. It meant that there was an agreement between the Puritan communities and the members of them with each other. Okay, this, again, reinforces the communal spirit in New England and the formation of New England towns that's really different from the settling of Virginia. Okay, just an example here. This is a primer. A primer is an elementary school book, and this would teach children about reading and writing and religion. Those were the primary subjects that were and skills that were reinforced in the early churches. So this is, of course, is a shot of Plymouth Plantation in the winter. In the first year, we know that very few people actually survived, only 44 of the original 102. And at some point, there were actually only a few that could take care of the others. There are all of these myths surrounding the first Thanksgiving, and I actually won't go into a lot of them right now, but the basic idea is this. The original settlers would not have survived without the help of the Wampanoag tribe and the American Indians who were there at the area. And they actually formed an agreement with Massasoit, who was the chief of the time, and that created 41 years of peace from 1621 all the way to 1662. And that was pretty profound and especially important considering Spanish and previous English attempts to settle and the patterns that were formed with how the settlers originally decided to interact with Native Americans. Okay, so we have William Bradford, who was the leader of the community. He was elected 30 times as governor. This is in Plymouth Plantation. We'll later learn about John Winthrop. I wanted to give you an idea of how New England was settled. So we see here that in the early periods, and of course you can take a look at Sandwich, 1637, one of the earliest settlements on the Cape, and of course the oldest town on Cape Cod. We see here that if we look at this map, there are a lot of interesting developments. One is that it's pretty predominant that the coast is developed first. But if you notice, there are some parts of the coast here that are not developed, as well as some inland areas. And of course, that represented strongholds of Native American tribes, specifically the Narragansett, the Wampanoag, and later around Mount Wachusett, the development of resistance that King Philip will use in his war. So I'm going to pause the PowerPoint right now and the YouTube video, and I'm going to keep them recorded in 15-minute segments. So we'll consider this part 1 of the New England PowerPoint lecture. And then I'll come and pick up here in part 2.